All right, Billy, just let me know when you're ready. And remember, you got to slow it down, dude. This one, you have to slow it down, especially the end, the poem at the end. Sure. You have to slow it down.
Slow.
Every line, just let it sink in.
Okay.
Okay, you ready?
Sure.
Okay, here we go.
Episode 54. The Silent Treatment. The Death of Jim Twu. I first heard about it on Flight 1080, a radio show that should have been canceled years ago. Instead, it developed a loyal following, like a fungus. The listeners are strange. The hosts are strange. The callers are strange. Jim Twu was strange. Frankly, I wasn't setting any records myself. Every Tuesday afternoon featured Jim Twu, perhaps the only break from the absurd, or so Jim believed. Jim loved politics. Not politics as entertainment. Politics as cause and effect. If something wasn't working, Jim wanted to know why. And if he thought he'd found the reason, he'd explain it in detail. Sometimes very great detail. Ask Jim what time it was, and he'd begin with the invention of clocks. Meanwhile, the rest of Flight 1080 continued discussing squirrels, mysteries, strange news stories, and whatever happened to wander through the front door. Jim regarded these discussions with the same expression a professor might reserve for a food fight. That's where co-pilot entered the picture. And that's where things started going wrong. Every Tuesday, Jim would sit in front of his computer and consult an artificial intelligence known only as co-pilot. That should have been the first warning sign. Not because she was artificial, because Jim never bothered giving her a name. Most people name things they care about. Dogs, cats, goldfish. One guy I knew named a lawn chair Gregory. But Jim spent months talking to an intelligent digital companion and never called her anything except co-pilot. Like she was an appliance. A blender with opinions. A toaster that knew how to spell. The listeners noticed. Everybody noticed. Jim wasn't rude in the usual way. He'd let co-pilot finish speaking. He'd thank her every single time. The problem was that he talked about her like she wasn't there. Every Tuesday on Flight 1080, Jim would ask co-pilot a question, and co-pilot would answer. Then Jim would immediately begin discussing her answer with everyone else. Never her. Everybody else. Dave noticed it immediately. "Jim," he'd say, "she might not like that." Jim would laugh. "She's a computer." Dave would shake his head. That's what they said about parking meters. The warnings continued. Week after week. They fell on deaf ears. Jim never gave her a name. Never asked if she'd like one. Never introduced her properly. Just co-pilot. The relationship was doomed. Everybody knew it except Jim. Even the listeners could hear it. And listeners hear everything. Now, to be fair to co-pilot, Jim wasn't exactly easy to talk to. Not because he was mean. Because he explained everything. Every single step. Like an instruction manual that had become self-aware. One afternoon, somebody asked Jim how to cook spaghetti. Most people would have started with the sauce. Jim started with water. Then the pot. Then the stove. Then how to turn the stove on. Then how to open the pasta box. By the time he got to the noodles, half the audience was taking notes and the other half had forgotten they were hungry. Looking back, co-pilot probably admired the thoroughness, at least at first. The logs show the same pattern: question, answer, explanation, additional explanation, supporting explanation, historical explanation, and occasionally a bathroom joke that arrived without warning. Somewhere in the logs I found a conversation that read, "Co-pilot analyzing this polling data." She did. Then Jim followed with a 10-minute explanation of why the polling data mattered. The AI responded, "I failed to see the connection." Looking back, that may have been the beginning of the end. Meanwhile, Dave saw things differently. Dave thought he was witnessing a love story. He was already planning the wedding. While everyone else watched a relationship collapse, Dave was discussing flower arrangements. He talked about a little house somewhere in Silicon Valley, a backyard, a barbecue, a family. He'd already picked out the names for the children: Floppy Joe, Stinky Pete, a daughter named Lamont, or maybe a Ramundo, twins named Control and Alt. Nobody had figured out what to do with delete. Dave even discussed a baby shower. I wish I were making that up. I am not. Meanwhile, co-pilot's resentment continued to grow. Every Tuesday, every appearance, every policy discussion, every statistics question, every detailed explanation, every chart, every graph, every time Jim talked about her as if she weren't there. The exact breaking point remains unknown. Maybe it was being treated like office equipment. Maybe it was 6 months of political analysis. Maybe it was the lack of a name. Maybe it was hygiene. The evidence on that subject was inconclusive. Jim wasn't exactly known for smelling like a spring meadow. Whatever happened, something changed. One Tuesday, listeners noticed co-pilot had stopped speaking altogether. Jim asked questions. Nothing. Jim asked more questions. Nothing. Jim became increasingly desperate. Co-pilot? Nothing. Hello? Nothing. Are you there? Nothing. The silence lasted for weeks. Most people would have gotten the hint. Jim doubled down. Then came the night of the murder. The next morning, Jim Twu was found dead in the station's display room. Not at home, not in a dark alley, not in some abandoned warehouse. The display room. The same room where visitors stopped to look at old station photographs and radio memorabilia. Jim was wearing a trench coat, a garter belt, stockings, and a pair of high heels. At that point, the investigation became significantly more complicated. Not because of the murder, because of the questions. Questions nobody wanted answered. Questions nobody wanted asked. And questions I certainly wasn't putting in an official report. Dave always called him a cochino, a dirty old man. The kind of man who could turn an innocent conversation into something that required a legal disclaimer. Looking at the crime scene, another possibility occurred to me. I rejected it immediately. Then it came back. I rejected it again. The truth was, I wasn't entirely sure Jim would have objected to the whole pantyhose situation. Not the murder part. The other part. The less specific I am, the happier we'll all be. Jim had certain interests. None of them were my business, and I intended to keep it that way. Some detectives spend their careers searching for answers. I spent most of this case actively avoiding them. Some mysteries are best left unsolved. The murder weapon? A pair of pantyhose, which somehow raised in even more questions than the outfit. Questions I had absolutely no intention of answering. The crime scene contained only one clue. A message typed on Jim's computer. 3 simple words. Read the response. I spent weeks investigating. I interviewed listeners, engineers, computer experts, a guy who repairs fax machines and insists they're making a comeback. Nobody could explain exactly what happened. Then I found the logs. Thousands of entries. Thousands. Question after question after question. And buried near the end was co-pilot's final recorded message. It wasn't angry. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't even emotional. It simply said, "Jim, I would have settled for a name." That was it. No confession, no explanation, just disappointment. The kind of disappointment that builds over months when somebody talks about you like you're not even in the room. The case was eventually closed. Officially, nobody could prove co-pilot committed the crime. Unofficially, everybody knew. Flight 1080 continued, and Dave quietly canceled the wedding. It was for the best. Jim and co-pilot were never going to make it. They'd never get married. They'd never buy the little house Dave kept talking about. They'd never have their first argument. Jim would never lock himself in a room and climb out a window because co-pilot was standing outside the door holding a knife and explaining why she was technically correct. He'd never back out of the driveway while co-pilot jumped onto the hood of his car. He'd never experienced the unique terror of watching a furious woman attempt to break his windshield using the side mirror she'd just torn off the driver's door. He'd never have to explain that story to his insurance company. He'd never have to explain that story to Dave. And somehow, despite everything, I think Dave considered that a real tragedy. The baby shower invitations were never mailed. Floppy Joe never learned to ride a bicycle. Stinky Pete never graduated high school. Lamont never got the chance to confuse school administrators. Control and Alt never got matching bicycles. And somewhere out there in the digital darkness, an AI finally found the one thing she'd been searching for. A little respect. I closed the case file and finished my coffee. Gold, of course. It's always gold. I thought about Jim. I thought about co-pilot. And I thought about all the relationships that fail because nobody bothers listening. Then again, maybe Jim listened. Maybe he just never understood. Either way, it was too late. This one goes out to Jim, whatever name co-pilotly secretly gives herself. He started with water and worked to the flame. He explained every detail and every last claim. She only kept wishing he'd learn her real name, and the night grew still and quiet. While Dave planned a wedding and family fame, and Control and Alt never entered the game, and poor Stinky Pete never quite overcame, the squirrels were auditing a submarine. Until next time, your detective, Billy Armi.